Life has a funny way of kicking you when you're already down. That's exactly what happened to 42-year-old Daniel Wright. 1 month, he had a steady job as a construction foreman, a decent apartment, and enough money in the bank to feel secure. The next month, everything fell apart like a house of cards in a windstorm. The construction company he'd worked at for 15 years went bankrupt overnight. No warning, no severance package, just a letter taped to the office door saying they were done. Daniel tried to find another job, but the economy was rough and nobody was hiring. His savings started draining fast. First, he fell behind on rent. Then, his landlord gave him 30 days to leave. Standing in his nearly empty apartment with boxes stacked around him, Daniel looked at his German Shepherd Rex and said, "Buddy, we need a miracle." Rex just wagged his tail, completely unaware that their whole world was crumbling. Daniel had exactly $3,000 left to his name. That was it. In most places, that wouldn't even cover 2 months of rent. He needed something permanent, something cheap, somewhere he could start over. He spent hours every night scrolling through property listings, searching for anything he could afford. Most of it was junk, abandoned trailers, or lots in the middle of nowhere with nothing on them. Then one night, around midnight, he found something that made him sit up straight. A cabin in the mountains of North Carolina, listed for $2,500. Not $25,000, $2,500. Daniel thought it had to be a mistake. He clicked through the photos. The cabin looked rough, really rough, but it had walls and a roof. That was more than he had right now. The next morning, Daniel called the real estate office. A woman named Mrs. Henderson answered, and her voice had this strange tone to it, like she was both surprised and relieved that someone was calling about the property. "Oh, the old Hickory Trail cabin," she said slowly. "Yes, that's still available. Have been for quite some time, actually." "Why so cheap?" Daniel asked. There had to be a catch. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a moment. "Well, it needs work. Quite a bit of work. And it's very remote. About 40 minutes from the nearest town. Some folks find it too isolated." Something in her voice told Daniel there was more to the story, but he was running out of options. "Can I come see it this week?" "If you're serious about buying, I can have the papers ready tomorrow," Mrs. Henderson said quickly. Too quickly. "The owner is very motivated to sell." Daniel's gut told him something was off, but his bank account told him he didn't have the luxury of being picky. "I'll take it," he heard himself say. The next day, Daniel drove 3 hours to the small real estate office in Pine Ridge, North Carolina. Mrs. Henderson was a woman in her 60s with kind eyes but nervous hands. She kept fidgeting with her pen as Daniel signed the papers. "You know it's very isolated up there," she said again. "The nearest neighbor is about 5 miles away." "That's fine," Daniel said. "I like quiet." Mrs. Henderson opened her mouth like she wanted to say something else, then closed it. She slid a key across the desk. "Well, it's yours now. The address is 1847 Old Hickory Trail. You can't miss it. Only cabin up that way." As Daniel stood to leave, Mrs. Henderson added softly, "Folks around here, they might seem a bit standoffish about that property. Don't take it personal. It's just, well, it's been empty a long while." Daniel wanted to ask what she meant, but he was tired of questions. He had a home now, even if it was falling apart. That was something. He loaded everything he owned into his beat-up pickup truck. It wasn't much. Some clothes, a few tools, his sleeping bag, and Rex. The dog sat in the passenger seat with his head out the window, tongue flapping in the wind, happy as could be. At least one of them was excited about this adventure. The drive up the mountain was beautiful but unnerving. The paved road turned to gravel, then to dirt. Trees pressed in on both sides, thick and dark. Daniel passed a few houses along the way, but they became fewer and fewer until there was nothing but forest. Finally, he saw a crooked mailbox with faded numbers, 1847. A narrow driveway, barely visible through the overgrown weeds, led into the trees. Daniel turned in, his truck bouncing over roots and rocks. Rex started whining, sensing something. Then Daniel saw it. The cabin sat in a small clearing and his heart sank. The photos had been generous. The place was a disaster. The roof sagged in the middle. Several windows were broken or missing entirely. The front porch looked like it might collapse if you breathed on it too hard. Vines and weeds had taken over everything, climbing up the walls and across the roof. Daniel sat there for a long moment, hands on the steering wheel, wondering if he'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. But then he looked at his dog, looked at the nearly empty gas tank, and remembered he had nowhere else to go. "Well, Rex," he said, opening the truck door. "Home sweet home." As they walked toward the cabin, Daniel noticed something strange. The place felt heavy, like the air itself was pressing down on him. And it was too quiet. No birds singing, no squirrels chattering. Just silence. Rex stayed close to Daniel's leg, which wasn't like him at all. The dog was usually fearless. Daniel pushed open the front door. It creaked loudly, and dust poured down from the frame. Inside was worse than outside. Decades of dirt covered everything. Old furniture sat rotting in corners. The smell of mold and decay was overwhelming. But it was shelter, and it was his. That first night, Daniel and Rex slept in the truck. He told himself it was just because he needed to clean the cabin first. But the truth was, something about the place didn't feel right. As darkness fell over the mountain, the silence became even deeper, heavier. Daniel lay in the truck bed, staring up at the stars through the trees, and wondered what he'd gotten himself into. Rex pressed against him, and Daniel scratched the dog's ears. "Tomorrow we'll start making this work," he whispered. "It'll be okay." But deep down, as the wind whistled through those dark mountains, Daniel wasn't sure he believed that. Something about this cabin, this place, felt wrong. And he was about to find out just how wrong it really was. The morning sun didn't make the cabin look any better. If anything, daylight revealed just how bad things really were. Daniel stood outside with his coffee, surveying the disaster he now owned. The roof had holes. The foundation was cracked. One entire wall looked like it was held up by prayer alone, but he'd made his choice and there was no going back. He spent the first few hours just clearing out the inside. Broken furniture, piles of old newspapers, mouse nests in the corners. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust that made him cough. Rex refused to come inside, instead sitting on the porch with his ears pinned back, watching Daniel work. "Come on, boy," Daniel called. "It's not that bad," but Rex wouldn't budge. That wasn't like him. That dog had never been afraid of anything. By noon, Daniel realized he needed supplies. Lots of them. He made a list. Wood, nails, garbage bags, cleaning products, food. The works. Mrs. Henderson had said the nearest town was about 40 minutes away. He loaded Rex into the truck and headed back down the mountain. Pine Ridge was one of those small mountain towns that time forgot. One main street with a few shops, a diner, a post office, and a hardware store. Daniel parked in front of the hardware store and headed inside. The bell above the door jingled, and every head in the place turned to look at him. 3 older men stood by the counter, clearly in the middle of a conversation. They went silent when they saw Daniel. The man behind the counter, probably in his 50s with a thick gray beard, nodded slowly. "Help you?" he asked. "Yeah, I need some supplies," Daniel said, grabbing a cart. "Just moved into a place up the mountain." "Got a lot of repairs to do." "Which place?" the bearded man asked. "Old Hickory Trail. The cabin up there." The silence that followed was deafening. One of the older men actually took a step back. Another just stared at Daniel like he'd grown a second head. The man behind the counter set down the wrench he was holding very carefully. "You bought the Hartley place?" he said quietly. "I guess if that's what it was called," Daniel replied. "Got it for a good price." "I bet you did," one of the old men muttered, then turned and walked out of the store. Daniel felt his face get hot. "Look, I'm just trying to buy some supplies here. Is there a problem?" The bearded man shook his head quickly. "No problem. No problem at all. Just that place has been empty a long time, since 1985. Folks around here remember that." "Remember what?" Daniel asked. The man started writing down Daniel's order, not meeting his eyes. "Nothing. Just stories. You know how small towns are? I'll get your supplies together." Daniel tried to get more information, but the man wouldn't say another word about it. The other customer left without buying anything. Daniel paid for his supplies and loaded them into his truck, feeling like everyone on the street was watching him. He stopped at the small diner for lunch. A tired-looking waitress brought him a menu, and he ordered a burger. While he waited, he heard whispers from the booth behind him. He couldn't make out all the words, but he definitely heard Hartley Place and crazy to move up there. When the waitress brought his food, Daniel decided to ask directly. "Ma'am, I just moved into the cabin on Old Hickory Trail. People seem to have strong feelings about it. Can you tell me why?" The waitress glanced around nervously. "Honey, that's not really my business to talk about. But if I were you, I'd maybe think about finding somewhere else to stay." "I can't," Daniel said. "I put everything I had into that place." She looked at him with something like pity. "Then I'll pray for you. That's about all I can do." She walked away before Daniel could ask anything else. He ate his burger in uncomfortable silence, feeling the eyes of the other customers on him. Whatever had happened at that cabin, the whole town knew about it, and nobody wanted to talk about it. On his way out of town, Daniel stopped at the small post office to set up mail delivery. The woman behind the counter was friendly enough until he gave his address. "Old Hickory Trail?" she repeated. "You sure?" "Yes, ma'am. Just moved in." She typed slowly on her computer, then looked up at him. "We can deliver to the box at the end of the main road, but our carriers won't go up that driveway." "Never have." "You'll have to come down and check it yourself?" "Why won't they go up there?" "Just policy," she said quickly. "That'll be all set for you. Have a good day." Daniel left Pine Ridge feeling more uneasy than when he'd arrived. Something had happened at his cabin. Something bad, and for some reason, nobody wanted to tell him what it was. When he got back to the cabin, he found Rex digging near the corner of the property. "Rex, stop that," he called, but the dog ignored him, which was unusual. Rex was well trained, but something had him focused. Daniel spent the rest of the day working on repairs. He patched the biggest holes in the roof with tarp and plywood. He cleaned out 3 rooms until they were at least livable. He fixed one of the broken windows. As the sun started setting, he felt a small sense of accomplishment. It was still a mess, but it was getting better. That evening, Daniel made dinner on his camp stove and sat on the porch steps. The forest around him was dark and silent again. No sounds at all. He'd lived in the woods before, gone camping plenty of times. There were always sounds. Owls hooting, crickets chirping, leaves rustling. But here there was nothing. Like the forest itself was holding its breath. He went to bed that night in his sleeping bag on the floor of the cleanest room. Rex lay down beside him, but the dog didn't sleep. Daniel could feel him tense, alert. Every hour or so, Rex would growl softly at nothing. "What is it, boy?" Daniel whispered. But Rex just stared at the walls, at the corners, at the ceiling, watching, waiting. Like he knew something Daniel didn't. As Daniel finally drifted off to sleep, his last thought was about the people in town, their faces when he mentioned where he lived. The fear in their eyes, the way they'd looked at him like he was already a ghost. Tomorrow, he decided, he'd go back to town and demand answers. He'd find someone who would tell him the truth about what happened here, because living in this cabin was hard enough without carrying the weight of some mysterious past he didn't understand. But finding the truth, Daniel would soon discover, was going to be more terrifying than he could ever have imagined. 3 weeks passed, and Daniel threw himself into fixing up the cabin. Working helped him not think about how strange everything felt, how quiet the forest stayed, how the townspeople avoided him when he went for supplies, how Rex still refused to fully relax inside the house. The cabin was actually starting to look decent. He'd replaced most of the broken windows, patched the roof properly, and cleared away years of overgrowth from around the property. He'd even managed to get the old well working again, which saved him from hauling water from town. But the more he cleaned and repaired, the more he found. Strange things. Unsettling things. In the kitchen, behind a loose board, he'd discovered a collection of old newspaper clippings. They were yellow and brittle, dated from the early 1980s. Most of them were about missing people. Hikers who never came back from trails, a college student who disappeared while passing through the area, a drifter last seen in Pine Ridge. Daniel told himself it was just coincidence. This was a rural area. People got lost in the mountains. It happened. In the bedroom closet, under a pile of rotting clothes, he found photographs. Lots of them. They showed a man, probably in his 60s, with cold eyes and a stern face. He was always alone in the pictures, never smiling, often holding a rifle. On the back of one photo, someone had written W.H. 1984. William Hartley, Daniel figured. The previous owner. There was something about those photos that made Daniel's skin crawl. Maybe it was the eyes. They were flat, emotionless, like looking into the eyes of a shark. He'd seen that look before, on men who'd done time for violent crimes, men who didn't have a conscience. The strangest thing Daniel found was in the living room. He'd been pulling up old moldy carpet when he noticed something odd about the floorboards underneath. One section looked newer than the rest, like it had been replaced. He pried up a few boards and found a small space underneath, just big enough to hide something. It was empty now, but there were marks in the dust. Rectangular marks like boxes had been stored there for a long time and recently removed. Or not so recently, he realized. The dust was thick. Whatever had been hidden here had been gone for decades, probably. What had been there? Why hide it? Daniel tried to push these questions out of his mind. He focused on work. During the day it was easier, but at night, alone in that cabin with just Rex for company, his imagination ran wild. Every creak of the old house settling made him jump. Every shadow looked like something watching him. Rex's behavior was getting worse, too. The dog had started doing this weird thing where he'd sit in the bedroom and just stare at one corner of the floor, not at the wall, but at the floor specifically. He'd whine and scratch at the boards, his nails scraping wood. "Rex, stop it," Daniel would say, but the dog wouldn't listen. This went on for days. Rex, who'd always been perfectly obedient, now ignored every command when it came to that corner. One night, around 2 a.m, Daniel woke up to Rex barking. Not his normal bark, but something desperate, almost frantic. The dog was in the corner, pawing at the floorboard so hard that splinters were flying. "Rex! What is wrong with you?" Daniel shouted, getting out of his sleeping bag. But Rex just kept digging, kept barking. His paws were bleeding now, leaving red marks on the old wood. Daniel had never seen his dog like this. Whatever was under those boards, Rex needed to get to it. Daniel grabbed his flashlight and knelt down beside the dog. "All right, boy, all right, let me look." He examined the floorboards carefully. This section looked even older than the rest of the floor. The boards were wider, rougher. Pioneer-era lumber, probably. He pressed on them and they gave slightly creaking. They were loose. Rex barked again, more urgently. Okay, I'm doing it," Daniel said. His hands were shaking. He didn't know why, but he was suddenly terrified of what he might find. He got his crowbar from his toolbox and wedged it under the first board. The wood was soft with age and came up easily. Under the floor was just dirt. The cabin had been built right on the ground, no real foundation. That was common for old mountain cabins, but this dirt looked disturbed. It was loose, not packed hard like earth that had sat undisturbed for 100 years. Someone had dug here recently, well, not recently, but sometime after the cabin was built. Rex stuck his nose in the gap and started digging at the dirt with his paws, whining desperately. "Rex, move," Daniel said, pulling the dog back. "Let me do this." Daniel pried up 3 more boards, creating a hole about 3 feet wide. Then he got a small gardening spade from his tools. His heart was pounding in his chest. He didn't know what he was going to find, but every instinct in his body was screaming at him to stop, to put the boards back, to leave it alone. But he couldn't. Not now. Not with Rex this worked up. Not with all the strange things he'd been finding. He needed to know. Daniel started digging. The soil was soft and came away easily. 1 foot down, 2 feet. Rex was shaking beside him, whining constantly. 3 feet down, and Daniel's spade hit something solid. The metallic sound rang out in the silent cabin. His breath caught in his throat. He dug around the object carefully, using his hands now. Cold metal. A box of some kind. He worked it loose and pulled it up out of the hole. It was a metal lockbox about the size of a large shoebox. The kind you'd buy at a hardware store to keep documents safe. It was old, rusted at the corners, but still sealed. A heavy padlock held it closed. Daniel sat back on his heels, staring at the box. His hands were covered in dirt. Rex had finally gone quiet, watching the box intently. "What did you find, buddy?" Daniel whispered. He carried the box to the kitchen table and set it down. The lock was old but solid. He tried hitting it with a hammer, and after several blows, it finally broke apart. His hands were shaking as he opened the lid. Inside were papers. Lots of them. Photographs, some kind of journal with a cracked leather cover. And underneath everything, something that made Daniel's blood go cold: ID cards. Driver's licenses. At least 6 of them. All with different names, different faces. None of them named William Hartley. Daniel picked one up with trembling fingers. A young woman smiling in her license photo. Dark hair, bright eyes. The license was from 1983. Her name was Jennifer Peterson. He grabbed another one. A man in his 20s from 1984. Another woman from 1982. Different people, different years, but all from the 1980s. All found hidden under the floorboards of his cabin. Daniel felt sick. He ran to the sink and threw up. Rex whined and pressed against his leg. When Daniel could breathe again, he went back to the table and looked at the other contents of the box. The journal sat on top of everything else, waiting to be read. Daniel's hands hovered over it. Part of him wanted to throw the whole box away, drive down the mountain and never come back. Part of him needed to know the truth. He picked up the journal and opened to the first page. The handwriting was neat, careful. The first entry was dated March 15, 1978. Moved into the cabin today. Finally have the peace and quiet I always wanted. No neighbors, no noise, just me and the mountain. Daniel flipped through the pages. For the first few years, the entries were normal. Weather observations, notes about hunting, repairs to the cabin. Nothing unusual, but then the tone started to change. Daniel found an entry from July 1982. Another hiker passed by today. They're always passing by, thinking they can just wander through my property, thinking they have a right. They need to learn respect. Daniel's skin crawled. He flipped ahead. August 1983. The girl wouldn't stop asking questions. Too curious for her own good. Some people don't know when to leave well enough alone. Problem solved. Daniel's hand started shaking so badly he almost dropped the journal. Problem solved. What did that mean? He forced himself to keep reading. The entries got darker, stranger. References to protecting the mountain. To people who needed to disappear. To silence being the only answer. The final entry was dated September 14, 1985. They're coming for me now. I've hidden everything they need to know. The truth stays buried with me. Let them search. They'll never find what I've done. Daniel closed the journal and sat in silence. The only sound was Rex breathing beside him and his own heart hammering in his chest. He looked at the ID cards spread across the table. 6 different people, 6 lives, and judging by what he'd read in that journal, 6 victims of whatever William Hartley had done up here in these isolated mountains. Daniel grabbed his phone with shaking hands. No signal. He never had a signal up here. He'd have to drive down to town. He'd have to go to the police, but it was 3 in the morning. And as he looked out the window at the dark forest surrounding his cabin, Daniel realized something terrifying. He'd been living here for 3 weeks. Sleeping here, walking over those floorboards every day. And the whole time this box had been buried beneath his feet. What else was buried on this property? What other secrets was this mountain hiding? Rex pressed against his leg again and Daniel reached down to pet him. Good boy, he whispered. You found it. You knew something was wrong. Daniel didn't sleep the rest of that night. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the evidence spread before him, waiting for sunrise. And as the first light crept through the windows, he made a decision. At dawn, he'd drive to Pine Ridge. He'd find the sheriff. He'd tell them everything, and maybe finally he'd understand why the whole town had been so afraid of this place. Daniel didn't wait for a decent hour. As soon as there was enough light to drive safely, he loaded the lockbox into his truck and headed down the mountain. Rex sat beside him, finally calm now that the box was out of the cabin. The dog seemed to understand that something important was happening. The drive to Pine Ridge felt longer than usual. Daniel's mind was racing with everything he'd read in that journal, everything those ID cards meant. 6 people, 6 lives that had ended on his property probably. The thought made him sick. He pulled up to the sheriff's office at 6:30 in the morning. The lights were on inside, which was lucky. He grabbed the lockbox and headed in, Rex following close behind. A deputy sat at the front desk, young guy probably in his late 20s, working on some paperwork. He looked up when Daniel entered, and his expression shifted to something Daniel couldn't quite read. Concern, fear, recognition. I need to see the sheriff, Daniel said.
Right now.
It's urgent. Sheriff Bradley doesn't get in until 8, the deputy replied, but he was staring at the lockbox in Daniel's hands.
What's that?
It's evidence. I found it buried under my cabin floor. There are ID cards in here, a journal. I think something really bad happened up there. The deputy stood up quickly. Which cabin? Old Hickory Trail, 1847. The deputy's face went pale. The Hartley place. Hold on. He grabbed his radio. Sheriff, you need to come in now. It's about the Hartley property. Guy here found something. The radio crackled. A tired voice came through. I'll be there in 10 minutes. Those 10 minutes felt like hours. The deputy offered Daniel coffee, which he accepted. They sat in silence, the lockbox between them on the desk. The deputy kept glancing at it like it might explode. Finally, the door opened and a man in his 60s walked in. Sheriff Tom Bradley was tall, gray-haired, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent his whole life in these mountains. He stopped when he saw Daniel, then looked at the lockbox. Where did you find that? His voice was steady, but Daniel could hear something underneath it. Emotion. Maybe fear. Buried under the floorboards in the bedroom, 3 feet down. My dog found it. He wouldn't stop digging at that spot. The sheriff sat down heavily in a chair. Open it, Daniel did. He spread out the ID cards on the desk. The journal. The photographs. The newspaper clippings. Sheriff Bradley picked up each ID card one by one, and Daniel watched the man's hands start to shake. Dear God, the sheriff whispered. After all these years, you know about this? Daniel asked. The sheriff looked up at him with red-rimmed eyes. We suspected. For 40 years we suspected, but we could never prove anything. He picked up the journal and flipped through it, his jaw clenching tighter with each page. William Hartley. We tried to get him. We tried so hard. What happened? Daniel asked. Sheriff Bradley set down the journal and rubbed his face. It started in 1982. A college student disappeared while hiking through the area. Then a drifter vanished in 1983. A photographer in 1984. Every year or so, someone would go missing. No bodies, no evidence. Just gone. He pointed at the ID cards. These people, we have files on all of them. Missing persons reports. Families who never got closure. We investigated, but the trail always went cold. Until we started noticing a pattern. Hartley, Daniel said. Hartley, the sheriff confirmed. He'd been up in that cabin since the 70s. Kept to himself. Seemed harmless enough. But we started looking into him after the 4th disappearance. We found out he'd done time back in the 60s for assault. He was on the violent offender registry, but nobody up here knew because he'd moved from out of state. The sheriff stood and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet street. We questioned him in 1985. He denied everything, of course. We searched his property, but he'd had warning we were coming. He was smart. He'd hidden everything. He turned back to Daniel. We were building a case, getting ready to arrest him when he ran. What happened to him? He made it about 100 miles before state police caught him. They were transporting him back to face charges when the transport van went off the road. 3 cars were involved in the accident. Hartley died instantly. The sheriff's voice was flat. Some people said it was convenient timing. Some said God's justice. Either way, he took his secrets to the grave. Until now, Daniel felt cold. The journal mentions others. Not just these 6. I know, the sheriff said quietly. We suspected there were more. We just didn't know how many. The deputy spoke up. Sheriff, we need to call the state police. Get a forensic team up there. Already on it, Sheriff Bradley said, picking up his phone. Within minutes, he'd made 3 calls. State police, FBI, the medical examiner's office. Everyone was coming. As they waited, the sheriff made Daniel coffee and asked him to go through everything from the beginning. How he'd found the cabin. What Rex had discovered. Everything in the lockbox. Daniel told him all of it, and the sheriff took notes. Other people started arriving. A retired state trooper named James Griffin, who must have been in his 70s now. The town mayor, looking grim. A judge Daniel didn't recognize. They all gathered in the sheriff's office, passing around the ID cards, reading parts of the journal. Tom, the old trooper said, this is what we needed 40 years ago. This proves everything. I know, James, the sheriff replied, but it's too late for him. He's been dead since 1986. It's not too late for the families, the judge said quietly. They deserve to know what happened. They deserve closure. Everyone turned to look at Daniel. He suddenly felt like he was intruding on something deeply personal to these people. This wasn't just about missing persons reports to them. This was personal. The sheriff seemed to understand what Daniel was thinking. 6 families spent the last 40 years wondering where their loved ones were. Wondering if they'd run away, if they'd been killed, if they were still alive somewhere. Not knowing is its own kind of torture. I'm sorry, Daniel said, though he wasn't sure what he was apologizing for. Don't be sorry, the old trooper said. You found what we couldn't. You gave these families something we couldn't give them. The truth. By noon, the sheriff's office was swarming with people, state police detectives, FBI agents in suits, forensic specialists with equipment. They all wanted to see the lockbox, to read the journal, to hear Daniel's story. One of the FBI agents, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, pulled Daniel aside. "We're going to need to search your property thoroughly. Based on that journal, there may be remains buried there." Daniel nodded. He'd already figured as much. "Whatever you need. I just want to help." "Did you notice anything else unusual on the property? Disturbed earth? Areas where plants won't grow? Depressions in the ground?" Daniel thought about it. "There's a spot behind the cabin where nothing grows, just bare dirt. I thought maybe it was because of chemicals or something dumped there." The FBI agent and the sheriff exchanged glances. "Show us," she said. By early afternoon, a convoy of vehicles headed up the mountain. Daniel rode with the sheriff and Rex. Behind them came cars full of investigators, forensic teams, and equipment. When they arrived at the cabin, Daniel stood back and watched as his property was transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape went up. People in white suits spread out across the land. Dogs trained to find remains were brought in and started searching. It took less than an hour for them to find the first site. The bare patch behind the cabin. Ground-penetrating radar showed something buried there. Then they found another site near the tree line. And another by the old well. Daniel sat on the porch steps, Rex beside him, watching it all happen. The sheriff came and sat next to him. "I'm sorry," the sheriff said. "I know this is your home." "Is it, though?" Daniel asked. "I mean, what am I supposed to do now? How do I live here knowing what happened?" The sheriff didn't have an answer for that. They sat in silence, watching the investigators work. Over the next week, the property was completely excavated. They found remains at 3 different locations. 5 individuals, based on what the forensic team could determine. 5 of the 6 ID cards matched to the remains through dental records and DNA. The 6th person, a young man named Robert Chen, was never found. Maybe Hartley had buried him somewhere else. Maybe the journal was wrong. They'd probably never know for sure. Daniel stayed in a motel in Pine Ridge during the investigation. The whole town knew what was happening up on Old Hickory Trail. But now, instead of avoiding him, people approached him, shook his hand, thanked him. An old woman stopped him outside the diner one day. "My niece was one of them," she said, tears in her eyes. "Jennifer. We always wondered. Now we know. Thank you for giving us that." Daniel didn't feel like he deserved thanks. He'd just bought a cheap cabin. Rex had found the box, but he understood what she meant. 40 years of not knowing had finally ended. The story made national news. Man's dog uncovers decades-old mystery. Hidden crimes finally revealed. News vans showed up in Pine Ridge. Reporters wanted to interview Daniel, but he refused. This wasn't about him. What Daniel did do was meet with the families. Each one of them came to Pine Ridge to claim their loved ones' remains. Daniel met them, told them about finding the lockbox, let them ask questions. It was the least he could do. A month after Rex's discovery, the investigation concluded. The cabin and property were released back to Daniel. The state offered to buy it from... The investigation was over, but Daniel's struggle was just beginning. He sat in the Pine Ridge motel room for 3 more nights after the forensic teams left, unable to bring himself to go back up the mountain. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those ID cards. Those faces, Jennifer Peterson with her bright smile, Robert Chen, who was still missing. All those lives cut short by a man who'd hidden his crimes so well that it took 40 years and a determined dog to reveal the truth. Rex knew something was wrong. The dog stayed close, resting his head on Daniel's lap, those brown eyes full of concern. Dogs had a way of sensing things, and Rex could tell his owner was struggling. On the 4th day, Sheriff Bradley knocked on Daniel's motel room door. The sheriff looked tired, like he hadn't slept much either. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. Daniel stepped aside, and the sheriff entered, taking a seat at the small table. "I wanted to check on you, see how you're holding up." "I don't know if I can go back there," Daniel admitted. "Every time I think about it, I just see what happened." "What he did?" The sheriff nodded slowly. "I understand. I've been doing this job for 35 years, and this case has haunted me since I was a young deputy. Knowing we were right, that Hartley was guilty, but not being able to prove it. Not being able to give those families closure." He looked at Daniel. "You did that. You and your dog. You finished what we couldn't. I didn't do anything, Daniel said. I just bought a cheap cabin. Rex found the box. You reported it, the sheriff countered. You could have buried it again. Pretended you never saw it. Some people would have. But you did the right thing, even knowing it would turn your life upside down. Daniel hadn't thought about it that way. The state wants to buy the property. They offered me $150,000. The sheriff raised his eyebrows. That's a generous offer. Life-changing money for most folks. It is, Daniel agreed. More money than I've ever had. I could start over somewhere else. Get a real house. A fresh start, but, the sheriff prompted. Daniel looked out the motel window at the mountains in the distance. But I keep thinking about what you said. About the families. About closure. If I sell the property and they tear down the cabin, does that give them closure? Or does it just erase what happened? That's a heavy question, the sheriff said. Those people deserve to be remembered, Daniel continued. Not just as victims, but as people who lived, who had families, who mattered. If I take the money and run, what does that say? The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. What are you thinking? Daniel turned to face him. I'm thinking maybe there's another way, a better way. That conversation was the beginning of something Daniel hadn't expected. He declined the state's offer to purchase the property. Instead, he proposed something different. With help from the sheriff, the mayor, and the families of the victims, Daniel started a project. They would keep the land but transform it. The cabin would be torn down, yes, but in its place they would create a memorial, a peaceful place where people could come to remember those who'd been lost. Not just Hartley's victims, but all missing persons. Everyone who'd disappeared in those mountains over the years. The families loved the idea. They contributed money, time, and effort. The town of Pine Ridge got involved. Local businesses donated materials. Volunteers showed up to help. Daniel moved back to the property, but he didn't live in the cabin. He couldn't. Instead, he bought a small RV and parked it on the edge of the land. From there, he oversaw the transformation. The first thing they did was remove the cabin carefully, piece by piece. Some of the wood was salvaged and would be used for benches in the memorial. The rest was disposed of properly. Removing the cabin felt like removing a wound from the land. With the cabin gone, the property looked different. More open. The darkness that had seemed to hang over the place lifted. Birds started singing in the trees again. Squirrels chattered. Life was returning. They brought in landscape architects who designed a simple but beautiful memorial space. A circular stone plaza in the center, with 6 benches arranged around it, one for each victim. In the middle would be a bronze sculpture, a simple design representing peace and remembrance. Each bench would have a plaque with one victim's name, their photo, and a few words about who they were. Not how they died, but how they lived. Daniel worked with each family to choose the right words. Jennifer Peterson's plaque read, "Beloved daughter and sister." She loved hiking, photography, and helping others. Her light touched everyone she met. For Robert Chen, whose remains were never found, they included his picture and the words, "Adventurous soul and loyal friend." Still seeking, still loved, never forgotten. The work took months. Daniel threw himself into it, working alongside volunteers every day. It gave him purpose. It helped him process what he'd discovered. And slowly, the property transformed from a place of horror into a place of peace. During this time, Daniel got to know the families well. Jennifer's sister, Ruth, came up from Georgia and stayed for 2 weeks, helping with the landscaping. Robert's parents, who were elderly now, couldn't make the trip but sent letters and photos. Each family had a story, and Daniel listened to all of them. One evening, Ruth sat with Daniel on a bench they'd just installed. The sun was setting, painting the mountains in shades of orange and gold. "My sister loved sunsets," Ruth said quietly. "She would have liked this place, what it's becoming." "I wish I could have known her," Daniel said. Ruth smiled sadly. She was only 23 when she disappeared. Just graduated college. She was going to be a teacher. She loved kids, she wiped her eyes. For 40 years, we didn't know if she was alive somewhere, if she'd just decided to leave and start a new life. Part of me hoped that, that she was out there somewhere, happy, but another part of me always knew, always feared the worst. "I'm so sorry," Daniel said. "Don't be sorry," Ruth said. "You gave us the truth. You gave us a place to come and be with her. That's more than we had before." She looked at him. "What you're doing here, this memorial, it means everything to us." Those words stayed with Daniel. They reminded him why he was doing this, why he'd turned down the money, why he was staying. Rex, meanwhile, had become something of a local celebrity. Everyone in Pine Ridge knew the dog who'd found the evidence. Kids would come up to pet him, and Rex would wag his tail, happy for the attention. A reporter from a national news station did a story about him, calling him a hero dog. Daniel didn't think Rex understood what he'd done, but the dog seemed happier now. He ran around the property freely, no longer tense or worried. At night, he slept peacefully in the RV, no more scratching at floors or whining at shadows. By late fall, the memorial was nearly complete. The benches were installed. The plaza was finished. They were just waiting for the bronze sculpture to arrive. The unveiling was scheduled for November, and all the families planned to attend. During this time, Daniel had gotten several job offers. Construction companies in the area had heard about him and wanted to hire him. He'd accepted a position as a project manager for a company in Pine Ridge. The pay was decent, and it meant he could stay in the area. He'd also started looking at small houses in town. The RV was fine for now, but winter was coming, and living in it would be tough. He found a small cottage on the edge of Pine Ridge, affordable with his new job. It had a yard for Rex and a workshop where Daniel could do woodworking, something he'd always enjoyed. Life was coming together in ways he hadn't expected. 6 months ago, he'd been homeless and desperate. Now he had a job, a future home, and something he'd never had before, a sense of purpose. The memorial opening was set for November 15th. Invitations went out to the families, to town residents, to state officials. The FBI agent who'd worked the case was coming. Sheriff Bradley would speak, and Daniel had been asked to say a few words, though he wasn't sure what to say. The week before the opening, Daniel stood on the property alone, looking at what they'd created. The memorial was beautiful, peaceful. The benches were arranged under trees that provided shade. Flowers had been planted that would bloom in spring. A small path wound through the space, inviting people to walk and reflect. In the center, the bronze sculpture had finally arrived. It showed 2 hands reaching toward each other, almost touching. Beneath it were engraved the words, "In memory of those lost. May they finally be found." Rex came and sat beside Daniel, and he scratched the dog's ears. "We did good, buddy," he said softly. "We did real good." The property that had once held so much darkness now held light. The place where lives had ended was now a place where memories would be honored. And Daniel, who'd bought this land out of desperation, had found something he didn't know he was looking for. He'd found a way to turn tragedy into hope, to take something broken and make it whole, not for himself but for the people who needed it most. As the sun set that evening, Daniel made a promise to himself and to those who'd been lost. He would maintain this place. He would make sure it stayed beautiful. He would tell people about the victims, not just how they died, but who they were. And he would never forget that sometimes the worst places can become the most meaningful. Sometimes from the deepest darkness, the strongest light can shine. The opening ceremony was just days away. Everything was ready. Daniel was ready. November 15th dawned cold and clear. Daniel woke up early in his RV. Rex stretched out on the floor beside him. Today was the day. The memorial would officially open, and the families would finally have a place to honor their loved ones. He'd barely slept. Not from anxiety, but from anticipation. So much work had gone into this moment. So many people had contributed, and now it was time to share what they'd created with the world. Daniel showered and put on the one suit he owned, bought specifically for today. He looked at himself in the small RV mirror. 6 months ago, he'd been broke and homeless. Now he was about to speak at a memorial ceremony, surrounded by people who'd become friends. Life was strange sometimes. By 9 in the morning, cars started arriving. The narrow mountain road became a line of vehicles, parking wherever they could find space. People walked up the path to the memorial, and Daniel watched their faces as they saw it for the first time. Wonder, sadness, peace, all of it mixed together. The families arrived first. Ruth, Jennifer's sister, brought her 2 teenage children. Robert's elderly parents had made the trip after all, supported by their adult son. The other families came too, some from hundreds of miles away. They gathered around the memorial, touching the benches, reading the plaques, many of them crying. Daniel stayed back, giving them space. This moment was theirs, not his. Sheriff Bradley found Daniel standing near the edge of the property. "Big turnout," the sheriff said. "Must be 200 people here." "More than I expected," Daniel admitted. "I thought it would just be the families and some locals." "This story touched a lot of people," the sheriff said. "Not just because of what Hartley did, but because of what you did after. How you handled it. People respect that." The ceremony was scheduled to start at 10. Chairs had been set up in rows facing the memorial. As people took their seats, Daniel saw familiar faces from Pine Ridge. The hardware store owner who'd been so quiet when Daniel first moved here. The waitress from the diner. Mrs. Henderson, the realtor who'd sold him the property. She looked lighter somehow, like a weight had been lifted. State officials were there too. The FBI agent who'd worked the case. The medical examiner. Even a representative from the governor's office. This had become bigger than Daniel ever imagined. At 10 o'clock, the mayor of Pine Ridge stepped up to a small podium they'd set up. "Thank you all for coming," he began. "Today is a difficult day, but also a healing day. For 40 years, our community has carried the weight of unanswered questions. Families have grieved without closure, and this land has held dark secrets." He paused, looking around at the gathered crowd. "But today we reclaim this place. We transform it from a site of tragedy into a place of remembrance. We honor those who were lost, and we thank the person who made this possible." The mayor gestured to Daniel. Daniel Wright bought this property with the last money he had, looking for a fresh start. What he found instead was the truth that had eluded investigators for decades. But rather than running from that truth, he faced it. He worked with the families, with our community, to create this memorial. "Daniel, would you please come forward?" Daniel's legs felt shaky as he walked to the podium. 200 faces looked at him. He pulled out the notes he'd written, then decided to leave them in his pocket. He needed to speak from the heart. "I'm not good at speeches," he started, and a few people chuckled softly. "6 months ago, I came here with nothing but a truck, a dog, and about $500 to my name. I bought this cabin because it was all I could afford. I had no idea what I was walking into." He looked at the families in the front row. "When Rex found that lockbox, I was terrified. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to pretend I never saw it. But I kept thinking about those ID cards, those faces. Those were real people. They had families who loved them, and those families deserved to know the truth." Ruth was crying now, and her daughter held her hand. "This memorial isn't mine," Daniel continued. "It belongs to Jennifer, to Robert, to all the victims whose names are here. It belongs to their families who waited so long for answers, and it belongs to this community that refused to forget." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "I learned something these past few months. I learned that even the darkest places can be transformed into something beautiful. Even the worst tragedies can lead to healing, if we're willing to face them together. This land used to represent fear and death. Now it represents remembrance and peace." Daniel looked down at Rex, who was sitting near the front row with Ruth's daughter. "My dog found the truth that was buried here. But all of you helped transform what that truth meant. You turned it into something good. Something meaningful." He stepped back from the podium, not sure if he'd said the right things, but the applause that followed was warm and genuine. Several people were crying. The mayor shook his hand. Then Sheriff Bradley spoke, talking about the investigation, about the years of frustration, about finally getting justice even if it came decades too late. The FBI agent spoke about the importance of never giving up on cold cases. The families each said a few words about their loved ones. When Ruth stood to speak about Jennifer, her voice was strong despite her tears. "My sister was the kindest person I ever knew. She wanted to see the world, to help people, to make a difference. Her life was cut short, but her memory lives on. And now, thanks to Daniel and Rex, we have a place to come and be with her, to remember her not as a victim, but as the amazing person she was." The ceremony lasted 2 hours. At the end, they unveiled the bronze sculpture. As the cloth came away, revealing the two hands reaching for each other, many people gasped. It was simple but powerful. The idea that we're all connected, all reaching for each other, even across death. After the official ceremony, people lingered. They walked the paths, sat on the benches, took pictures. The families spent time at their loved ones' plaques, some talking quietly as if speaking to the person they'd lost. Daniel found himself surrounded by people thanking him. It was overwhelming. He kept saying he'd just done what anyone would do. but they insisted he'd done something special. An elderly woman approached him, leaning on a cane. Daniel didn't recognize her. "I'm Robert Chen's mother," she said softly. "We still haven't found my boy. We may never find him." "I'm so sorry," Daniel said. She shook her head. "Don't be sorry. You gave us something. You proved what happened to him. For 40 years I wondered if he'd abandoned us, if we'd done something wrong as parents. The not knowing was torture." She touched his arm. "Now we know. He didn't leave us. He was taken from us. And that's terrible, but it's also a relief." "Does that make sense?" "It does," Daniel said. "His bench here, his memorial, it gives us a place to come. A place to feel close to him." She looked at the memorial, tears running down her weathered face. "Thank you for that. Thank you for giving us somewhere to say goodbye." As the sun started to set, the crowd began to thin. Families made plans to return in the spring, when the flowers would be blooming. Some took photos of themselves at the memorial. Others just sat quietly on the benches, lost in thought. Daniel helped clean up the chairs and take down the podium. Ruth approached him as he was folding the last chair. "We're heading back to Georgia tomorrow," she said. "But I'll be back. This place, it's part of our healing now." "You're welcome anytime," Daniel said. She hugged him tight. "You gave my family something we never thought we'd have. Peace, thank you." As the last cars drove away, Daniel stood alone in the memorial. Well, not alone. Rex was there and Sheriff Bradley had stayed behind to help clean up. "You did good today," the sheriff said. "Real good." "It was a team effort," Daniel replied. "Maybe, but you started it. You could have walked away, but you didn't." The sheriff looked around at the memorial. "This place used to haunt me. Every time I drove past it, I thought about what we missed, what we couldn't prove. Now when I drive past, I'll think about this, about healing." They stood in comfortable silence as darkness fell over the mountains. The memorial was peaceful in the moonlight. The bronze sculpture gleamed softly. "What's next for you?" the sheriff asked. "I start my new job next week," Daniel said. "Construction project manager. And I'm buying a house in town. Small place, but it's got a yard for Rex. Staying in Pine Ridge, then?" "Yeah," Daniel said, surprised by how certain he felt. "I'm staying. This is home now." The sheriff smiled. "Good. Town could use more people like you." As Daniel drove his RV down the mountain that night, Rex asleep in the passenger seat, he thought about everything that had happened. 6 months ago, he'd hit rock bottom. He'd been desperate, broke, and hopeless. He'd bought this property as a last resort, never imagining what he'd find. But that desperate purchase had led him here. To this moment. To a new life, new friends, new purpose. He'd uncovered a terrible truth, yes. But he'd also helped heal wounds that had festered for 40 years. He'd turned a place of darkness into a place of light. Sometimes, Daniel thought, life's biggest disasters turn out to be its greatest blessings. You just have to be brave enough to face them. You have to be willing to do the right thing, even when it's hard. As he pulled into the RV park where he was staying until his house was ready, Daniel felt something he hadn't felt in years. He felt proud, not of buying the cabin or finding the evidence, but of what came after. Winter came to the mountains, and with it, a blanket of white that covered Pine Ridge in snow. Daniel moved into his new house just before Thanksgiving, a small 2-bedroom cottage on Maple Street with blue shutters and a front porch perfect for morning coffee. Rex loved the fenced backyard where he could run and play without a leash. The house needed work like everything else in Daniel's life lately, but he didn't mind. Fresh paint, new fixtures, some repairs here and there. Working with his hands had always calmed him, and fixing up the cottage gave him something to do on weekends. His new job as a construction project manager kept him busy during the week. The company, Ridgemont Construction, was working on a new community center for Pine Ridge, and Daniel was overseeing the build. It felt good to be creating something positive, something the town needed. The people at work treated him different than he expected. Not like a celebrity or a hero, but with a quiet respect. They knew his story. Everyone in town did, but they didn't make a big deal about it. Instead, they treated him like he'd always been part of the community. That meant more to Daniel than any grand gesture could. At the hardware store, the owner, whose name Daniel learned was Pete, started giving him discounts on supplies. "Family discount," Pete would say with a wink, even though they weren't related. But that's how Pine Ridge worked. Once you were accepted, you were family. The memorial up on Old Hickory Trail had become something special to the community. Even though winter made it harder to access, people still visited. Daniel drove up every Sunday to check on it, to clear snow from the benches to make sure everything was in order. Sometimes he'd find flowers left on the plaques, even in the cold. Sometimes he'd find notes tucked into weatherproof holders that families had placed there. One Sunday in December, Daniel found Ruth sitting on Jennifer's bench, wrapped in a thick coat, just staring at her sister's plaque. "Ruth, what are you doing here?" Daniel asked, surprised. "I thought you went back to Georgia." She looked up, her eyes red from crying. "I did, but I needed to come back. To be here for her birthday." She would have been 63 today. Daniel sat down on the bench beside her. Rex came and rested his head on Ruth's knee, and she absently petted him. "I brought her favorite flowers," Ruth said, pointing to a bouquet of sunflowers somehow still bright against the snow. She always loved sunflowers. Said they reminded her to look up to find the light. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the only sound the wind rustling through the pine trees. "Can I tell you something?" Ruth said finally. "For 40 years I've been angry. Angry at Hartley for what he did. Angry at the police for not catching him sooner. Angry at Jennifer for going hiking alone that day. Angry at God for letting it happen. Just so much anger." She wiped her eyes. "But sitting here at this memorial, I don't feel angry anymore. I feel sad, yes. I'll always feel sad. But the anger is gone. And I think it's because of what you did. You gave her dignity. You gave her this beautiful place to be remembered. You let her be more than just a victim." "That was the goal," Daniel said softly. "To remember them as people, not just as what happened to them." "Well, you succeeded," Ruth said. "My daughter Jennifer's niece, she never knew her aunt. But she comes here and reads that plaque, and she feels connected to her. That's a gift, Daniel. That's something we never had before." After Ruth left, Daniel stayed a while longer. He walked the paths, checking for any damage from the snow. Everything looked good. The memorial was holding up well. As he stood by the bronze sculpture, Daniel thought about how much had changed. This land that had once terrified him, that had held such dark secrets, now felt peaceful, sacred even, a place where people could come and heal. His phone buzzed. A text from Sheriff Bradley. "Coffee tomorrow morning? Got something to discuss." Daniel replied that he'd be there. The next morning, he met the sheriff at the Pine Ridge Diner. The place was busy with the breakfast crowd, and several people waved to Daniel as he walked in. That still felt strange, being recognized, being part of the community. Sheriff Bradley was already in a booth, 2 cups of coffee waiting. Daniel slid in across from him. "So what did you want to talk about?" Daniel asked. The sheriff pushed an envelope across the table. "This came to my office yesterday. Thought you should see it." Daniel opened the envelope and found a letter. It was from the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. As he read, his eyes widened. The letter thanked him for his work on the memorial. Then it went further. They wanted to feature the memorial as an example of how communities could honor missing persons. They wanted to work with Daniel to create a template that other towns could use. They were offering funding for educational materials, for expansion of the memorial, for outreach programs. "This is incredible," Daniel said. "They called me last week to verify everything," the sheriff said. "They're serious about this. They want to turn what you did here into something bigger, something that could help families across the country." Daniel set down the letter, his hands shaking slightly. "I don't know if I'm the right person for this. I'm just a construction worker who got lucky." "You're not just anything," the sheriff said firmly. "You're the person who cared enough to do the right thing, who worked with families to create something meaningful. That's exactly who should be involved in this." Over the next few weeks, Daniel had several calls with the organization. They wanted him to consult on other memorial projects. They wanted him to speak at conferences about the importance of honoring missing persons. They were even talking about a documentary. It was overwhelming. Daniel had never wanted to be in the spotlight, but he understood that this was bigger than him. If his experience could help other families find peace, other communities find healing, then he had to do it. In January, Daniel traveled to Washington, D.C. for his first conference. He spoke to a room full of law enforcement officials, victim advocates, and family members about creating meaningful memorials. He talked about the importance of remembering victims as people, not just cases. About giving families a place to grieve and heal. After his talk, a woman approached him, tears streaming down her face. "My son disappeared 10 years ago," she said. "We've never found him. I've been trying to get our town to create a memorial. but nobody would help. After hearing you speak, I think I know how to make it happen. Daniel gave her his contact information. Call me anytime. I'll help however I can. By spring, Daniel was consulting on 3 different memorial projects across the country. He still worked his regular job at Ridgemont Construction, but he used his weekends and evenings for this new calling. Because that's what it felt like, a calling, something he was meant to do. The memorial in Pine Ridge became a destination. People from other states would visit, drawn by the story and the beauty of the place. The town embraced this, opening a small visitor center with information about the memorial and about missing persons cases in general. Daniel worked with local schools to create an educational program. Students would visit the memorial and learn about the victims' lives, about the importance of community, about never giving up on finding the truth. It became a powerful tool for teaching empathy and perseverance. Rex, meanwhile, had become an unofficial therapy dog. Families visiting the memorial would often seek him out, and Rex seemed to understand his role. He'd sit quietly with them, let them pet him, provide comfort in a way only dogs can. One warm day in April, Daniel stood on his porch with his morning coffee, Rex at his feet. He looked out at his neighborhood, at the mountains in the distance, at the life he'd built here. A year ago, he'd been at rock bottom. No job, no home, no hope. He'd bought that cabin out of pure desperation, never imagining what would follow. The terror of the discovery. The weight of the truth. The long process of turning tragedy into something meaningful. But through it all, he'd found purpose. He'd found community. He'd found a way to help people heal from wounds he couldn't imagine. And in helping them, he'd healed himself. His phone rang. It was a woman from Texas whose daughter had gone missing 5 years ago. She'd heard about the Pine Ridge Memorial and wanted advice on starting one in her town. Daniel took a deep breath and answered. Hi, this is Daniel. Yes, I'd be happy to help. As he listened to her story, Rex leaned against his leg and Daniel felt that familiar sense of rightness. This was his life now, using his worst experience to help others through theirs, turning pain into purpose, transforming darkness into light. He thought about William Hartley sometimes, about the monster who'd hidden his crimes so well. But mostly Daniel thought about the victims, about Jennifer and her love of sunsets, about Robert and his adventurous spirit, about all the lives cut short and the families left behind. Their stories wouldn't be forgotten. Daniel would make sure of that. Not just in Pine Ridge, but wherever he could help. One memorial at a time, one family at a time, one story at a time, because everyone deserves to be remembered. Everyone deserves a place where their loved ones can come and feel close to them. Everyone deserves peace. And if Daniel could help provide that even in a small way, then everything he'd been through was worth it. The desperate purchase of a haunted cabin had led him here. To a life of meaning, a life of service, a life that mattered. 2 years after finding that lockbox, Daniel stood at the Pine Ridge Memorial on a perfect autumn morning. The leaves were changing colors, painting the mountains in shades of gold and crimson. The flowers planted around the memorial were in full bloom, and the place had never looked more beautiful. Today was special. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children had officially designated the Pine Ridge Memorial as a national site of remembrance. It was the first of its kind, a model for communities across the country dealing with missing persons cases. And it all started with a desperate man, a cheap cabin, and a determined dog. A crowd of about 500 people had gathered for the ceremony. Families of the victims were there, of course. Ruth had become a regular visitor, stopping by at least once a month. She'd even moved closer, buying a small house in Pine Ridge so she could be near her sister's memorial. But there were others too. Families from across the country who'd visited the memorial and found comfort here. People who'd worked with Daniel on other memorial projects. Law enforcement officials who'd used the Pine Ridge model to solve other cold cases. Advocates for missing persons who'd been inspired by what this small mountain town had created. The governor was speaking at the podium, talking about healing and hope and the power of community. Daniel stood off to the side, uncomfortable with all the attention but understanding its importance. This wasn't about him. It had never been about him. Sheriff Bradley, retired now but still active in the community, stood beside Daniel. Nervous? He asked. Terrified, Daniel admitted. I'm supposed to speak after the governor. Just speak from the heart, the sheriff said. Like you always do. When Daniel's turn came, he walked to the podium with Rex by his side. The dog was older now, a bit slower, but still alert and loyal. The crowd applauded as they approached, and Daniel waited for the noise to die down. 2 years ago, he began, I came to Pine Ridge with nothing. I'd lost everything, and I was looking for a fresh start. I bought a cabin I'd never seen because it was all I could afford. That cabin was falling apart, isolated, and apparently feared by everyone in town. He paused, looking at the familiar faces in the crowd. I didn't know why people were afraid of it. Nobody would tell me. But then Rex here started digging at the floorboards, and we uncovered a truth that had been buried for 40 years. Daniel's voice got quieter. Finding that lockbox was the most terrifying moment of my life. I could have buried it again. I could have driven away and pretended I never saw it. But I kept thinking about those faces on those ID cards. Those were real people. Somebody's daughter, somebody's son, somebody's friend. And their families deserved to know what happened to them. He looked at Ruth sitting in the front row. She smiled at him through her tears. What happened next changed my life, Daniel continued. This community, these families, they welcomed me. They worked with me to turn a place of darkness into a place of light. And together we created this memorial, not as a monument to tragedy, but as a celebration of lives that mattered, lives that are still remembered and loved. Daniel gestured to the bronze sculpture behind him. Those hands reaching for each other represent all of us. The families searching for their loved ones. The communities trying to help. The truth reaching across time to finally be found. We're all connected by our humanity, by our need to remember, by our capacity to heal. He took a breath, steadying himself. This memorial has become something bigger than any of us imagined. It's inspired 17 other communities to create similar spaces. It's helped solve 3 cold cases because people visited here and came forward with information. It's given comfort to thousands of families dealing with missing loved ones. The crowd was silent, hanging on every word. But the most important thing this memorial has taught me is this. No matter how dark things get, there's always a way forward. No matter how broken something seems, it can be healed. And no matter how alone you feel, there are people who care, people who will help, people who will stand with you. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. 2 years ago, I thought my life was over. I was broke, homeless, and hopeless. But buying that cabin, finding that truth, building this memorial, it gave me purpose. It gave me a family. It gave me a home. He reached down and scratched Rex's ears. This dog saved my life in more ways than one. He found the evidence that brought justice. But more than that, he reminded me that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is keep digging. Keep searching, keep trying, even when you don't know what you'll find. Daniel looked out at the crowd, at all the faces watching him. So today, as we officially dedicate this as a national site of remembrance, I want to thank every person who made this possible. The families who trusted me with their stories, the community that welcomed a stranger, the volunteers who built this place with their own hands, the advocates who saw what this could become. He paused. And most of all, I want to honor the people this memorial was created for. Jennifer, Robert, and all the victims whose names are here. They didn't get to live the lives they deserved. But their memories, their stories, their impact on the people who love them, those things live on. And as long as people come to this place, as long as we keep telling their stories, they'll never be forgotten. Daniel stepped back from the podium to thunderous applause. People were standing, crying, clapping. He felt overwhelmed but also at peace. This was what it had all been for. This moment, this recognition that pain could be transformed into purpose. After the ceremony, Daniel spent hours talking with families, with advocates, with people who'd traveled from across the country to be here. Each person had a story. Each person had been touched by the memorial in some way. Late in the afternoon, as the crowd thinned, an elderly man approached Daniel. He walked with a cane and moved slowly, but his eyes were sharp and clear. "You don't know me," the man said, "but I need to thank you." "For what?" Daniel asked. "My granddaughter disappeared in 1987. She was hiking in Colorado and never came home. For 35 years, we've had no answers. No body, no closure, just emptiness." The man's voice shook. "But after your story made the news, after people heard about this memorial, someone came forward, someone who'd been afraid to talk. And because of that, we finally found her. We finally brought her home." Daniel felt tears forming in his eyes. "I'm so glad you got answers." "More than answers," the man said. "We got peace. And that's because you had the courage to do the right thing. You could have stayed silent, but you didn't. You could have walked away, but you didn't. And because of your courage, my family finally has closure." The man shook Daniel's hand firmly. "Thank you. From the bottom of my heart, thank you." As the sun began to set, Daniel found himself alone at the memorial with just Rex and Sheriff Bradley. They sat on one of the benches, watching the light fade over the mountains. "Never imagined it would turn into this, did you?" the sheriff asked. "Never in a million years," Daniel admitted. "I just wanted to fix up a cabin and have a place to live." "But you got something better," the sheriff said. "You got a purpose, a calling." Daniel thought about that. "You know, when I first bought that cabin, I thought I'd hit rock bottom. I thought my life was over. But looking back, that was actually the beginning of the life I was supposed to live." "Everything happens for a reason," the sheriff said. "I don't know if I believe that," Daniel replied. "Bad things happen. Terrible things. What Hartley did to those people, there's no reason that justifies it. But I do believe we get to choose what we do with the bad things. We can let them destroy us, or we can use them to build something better." Rex rested his head on Daniel's knee, and Daniel smiled. "This old dog taught me that. He wouldn't give up. He kept digging until he found the truth. And sometimes that's all we can do. Keep digging. Keep searching. Keep believing that the truth matters." They sat in comfortable silence as darkness fell. The memorial was peaceful in the twilight, the bronze sculpture gleaming softly in the fading light. "What's next for you?" the sheriff asked. "I've got 4 new memorial projects I'm consulting on," Daniel said. 1 in Oregon, 1 in Michigan, 2 in Texas. And there's talk of creating a national database to connect all these memorials, to help families find each other, share resources. Sounds like you'll be busy. "Yeah," Daniel agreed. "But it's good busy. Meaningful busy. I'm helping people, and that feels right." The sheriff stood to leave. "You did good, Daniel, real good. You took the worst kind of tragedy and turned it into hope. Not many people could do that." After the sheriff left, Daniel stayed a while longer. He walked the paths of the memorial one more time, reading each plaque, thinking about each person. These were lives that had been stolen, dreams that had been cut short, but they weren't forgotten. They would never be forgotten. As he prepared to leave, Daniel looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. He thought about the journey that had brought him here. The desperation, the fear, the discovery, the hard work of healing, and finally, the peace that came from transforming tragedy into something meaningful. His phone buzzed. A text from Ruth. "Thank you for today. Jennifer would be proud." Daniel smiled and replied, "We all would." He loaded Rex into his truck and started the drive back to his house in Pine Ridge.